Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you very much for being with us here today. And for those that showed up at 8 o'clock, I really, really do appreciate your time, Your Excellency. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Biltegi, for being with us here today, and we are looking forward to hearing from you as well. Mr. Doug Anderson, who I spoke to about this event at the very beginning from Anderson Associates, we'd also love to hear from you. We have one of the largest Egyptian organizations being represented here today by Mr. Mohammed Youssef, the Egyptian Businessmen's Association, so he'll be able to relay to his thousands of members what we are talking about. Most importantly, I'd like to thank His Excellency Ambassador Riley for giving us the opportunity to host this breakfast, and to, of course, thank Mr. Peterson for accepting our invitation to be with us here today. The main objectives of this breakfast, from our perspective as Global Trade Matters, we have maintained a very, very strong focus in the past 2 years on Egypt's position on the Global Competitiveness Index, and have been really trying to enhance what is called the competitiveness dialogue in Egypt. Egypt ranks 115 on the Global Competitiveness Index out of 138 countries. It is our main objective is to bring that ranking down from 115 to 99 within the next 2 years. Now that entails a lot of work, not just only by the government and civil society, but also the private sector. The dynamics of our economy are changing, and it at a very, very interesting pace, and we have to keep up with these changes, and we have to be able to actually identify the types of reforms that we basically need. The Egyptian government has come up with a strategy, the 2030 strategy, which is built on sustainable development. We believe that the way forward is real structural reforms. And New Zealand, on the agricultural sector, had undergone very similar or very large reforms in their agricultural sector, which is something that we can learn from on the long run. But most importantly, that after the flotation of the Egyptian pound, we have seen a great change in the dynamics and economics of the agriculture sector in Egypt, specifically in the dairy sector, which is one of the largest or biggest exports of New Zealand to Egypt. Now, what we want to talk about here today is one, the impact of that floating on Egyptian-New Zealand trade, which we would be very, very happy to actually increase, so hence the New Zealand-Egypt Business Council, I believe, that was created a year and a bit ago. But more importantly, we want the private sector to be 100% aware that we do have partners in New Zealand that have fantastic experience in this area, both in reforms, regulation, and in actual practice per se. And Mr. Peterson is a farmer by profession, and that's what makes this interesting, is we're not just listening to government officials, with all due respect, but we're listening to people that are on the ground that actually have a tremendous impact. And Mr. Peterson had played a great role in the 80s in implementing these reforms that saw, yes, a little bit of adversity at the beginning in New Zealand for their farmers, but what led to New Zealand becoming one of the largest exporters of agriculture and dairy, specifically around the world. There is a fantastic experimental project that was done in Saudi Arabia that had great technical know-how from New Zealand and has been a great success. We're aspiring to see that happen here in Egypt as well, as we believe that with these changes in dynamics in the dairy industry in Egypt, there could be a loss of market share for New Zealand on the long run. And we are trying as much as we possibly can to maintain that they do not lose that market share. And if that means for them to come on the ground and to work in Egypt, then that could be a fantastic advantage for all of us. I will leave the microphone to His Excellency Ambassador Riley to just talk about the general concept of bilateral trade between Egypt and New Zealand, and how he foresees the future, and then we'll move to Mr. Peterson to talk a little bit more about innovation, competitiveness in sustainable farming. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Ashraf. Really appreciate you organising this event this morning, and I'd like to acknowledge the representatives of important Egyptian organisations and businesses here today. I won't take up much of your time because, as Ashraf said, you didn't come here to listen to another government official. But what I will do is just provide a little bit of context and set the scene by just introducing Mike Peterson, and also talking about how this visit came about. So the New Zealand and Egypt had a meeting two or so months ago, and it was the first meeting of the New Zealand and Egypt Joint Trade Committee. And that discussion was very wide-ranging, but one clear message that came out of it was that Egypt was very interested in New Zealand's agricultural experience and wished to further discussions and collaboration in the agricultural sector as Egypt looked to develop its own agricultural sector. And so Mike's visit is really a first step by New Zealand to respond to that request from the Egyptian government. And it's a request that New Zealand was very, very happy to accede to, because Egypt is a very important economic partner for New Zealand. Many people don't realise, probably many people in New Zealand don't realise that Egypt is quite a big market for us, particularly in agricultural products, and as Ashraf mentioned, also particularly in dairy products. And so it's a relationship that New Zealand really values, and it's a relationship that we are committed to investing more in. And so Mike's visit is a first step in that. And one of the things that, for me as New Zealand ambassador, one of the things I'm hoping to come out of this visit is to identify some concrete areas where we can take our cooperation further forward. And so we hope to do that both through this discussion today, and then later this afternoon we're being taken on a visit by Egyptian agriculture officials to see some Egyptian farming practices. I think we're going to a dairy processing facility. I think we're going also to a slaughterhouse. And so we're really looking forward to that, because as much as it's good to talk about New Zealand's experience, for us it's equally important to better understand what Egypt's ambitions are in the agriculture sector, so that we can see how we can work together. So Ashraf, you mentioned the question of global competitiveness. And just by way of context, I'll just mention two things that have had quite an impact on New Zealand's global competitiveness. And they are, first, the size of New Zealand's market, our domestic market, and second, New Zealand's geographical location. So New Zealand is a small country. We're less than 5 million people, about 4.6 million people currently. So we have a saying in New Zealand, which is that we will never become rich, we will never develop a robust economy simply by selling to ourselves. So for a long time we've realised that accessing markets outside of New Zealand is critical for New Zealand's economy. And interestingly, our agricultural economy has been particularly successful in trading internationally. I think for New Zealand's major primary sectors, dairy, meat, we've got wines and maybe some horticulture also, up to 95% of New Zealand's production is exported. So the size of our economy has really pushed us to look throughout the world for markets to support our economy. The second sort of key challenge that I mentioned was around our distance from markets. And again, New Zealanders have traditionally talked about the tyranny of distance, the fact that the closest market to New Zealand, which is Australia, is over 2,000 kilometres away. And so if we look at our agricultural production, many of our important agricultural markets are literally on the other side of the world. So our distance from markets has been a significant factor, a significant challenge for New Zealand. We're always working to overcome that, but I think a key to it, and something that Mike will probably touch on in his talk, is that New Zealand has focused very precisely on the areas that we're good at. And so that means that we've stopped doing things that New Zealand was frankly not very good at. An easy example is the manufacture of motor vehicles. Up until 20 or 30 years ago, we used to have quite a substantial motor vehicle manufacturing capability in New Zealand. It was protected by border measures, but we fairly quickly realised that we weren't very good at making motor vehicles. We were good at some other things, some elements of agriculture in particular. And so part of our journey in becoming competitive and overcoming that tyranny of distance is focusing very carefully and very strategically on the areas that we are good at. And so that has enabled us to really grow our agricultural economy. So Mike is here to talk a little bit about that story, and he's really uniquely placed to do so, and I'm really happy to have him here. He's come a long way. Really appreciate it, Mike. Ashraf, as you said, Mike he's a farmer. He's got years, decades of practical experience in the New Zealand farming sector. He's won numerous awards in that sector, and he's also been a very important advocate for New Zealand farmers internationally. So he's spoken with farming sectors around the world, and he has a really good sense not only of New Zealand agriculture, but also of agricultural systems worldwide. So the seminar is an opportunity for Mike to talk a little bit about that. And then, as I said at the beginning, it's also an opportunity for us to understand better what Egypt's priorities are and to think about how we can work more closely together. So that's a really key outcome for me. And so I look forward to hearing from some of these distinguished guests who will help us in that quest. So I'll leave it there, Ashraf. So thank you very much again. It's much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. One more thing before we move on to Mike. I just want to thank Commercial International Bank, CIB, specifically Hisham Az Al-Arab, for his support throughout the past 2 years in our efforts of bringing that ranking down from 115 to 99. Without their support, we would not be able to put these events together. And it is vitally important, despite the technology age that we live in. I still believe that face-to-face dialogue resolves 3/4 of the problems. So these are very important meetings, and we intend to continue doing this, not just with New Zealand, but with our international partners. And let me tell you, New Zealand is the 13th most competitive nation in the world, despite what His Excellency was talking about, these two bottlenecks that they have, which is lack of proximity because of their geographic location, and obviously because of their market size. And market size, as we discussed in the conference, Your Excellency, is it's the highest pillar that you have on the Global Competitiveness Index. But other than that, they're one of the, if not the best financial development country in the world. They have some of the best financial markets, goods efficiency, labor market efficiency. I mean, they're doing really well on the Global Competitiveness Index, and there's a lot that we can learn from New Zealand in the future, and it's not wrong for us to be able to engage our international partners for us to better of ourselves. I really want to thank Mike for being here. And Mike, I'm going to give you the floor, and once we're done, we'll open it up for questions. We'd really like to hear comments and participation in this. Mike, thank you again, please.
Fantastic. And firstly, can I just thank you, Ashraf, for the kind welcome and introduction today. Certainly the opportunity to be here and talking with you at Global Trade Matters. For New Zealand, it is a great privilege to be able to travel around the world and to talk to people about not just our experience, but I also want to emphasise the Ambassador's comments about how this is very much a two-way dialogue. Please, we don't want to come here and talk to you. We'd like to talk with you, and we do this all around the world. I'd like just also agree, Ashraf, with your comments about the need for talk and dialogue and how valuable that can be. And very often, as a farmer, I travel around the world and I talk to farmers who think that it is unfair competing against New Zealand, and the issues are so different in New Zealand compared to their own farming systems at home. And when I sit down and talk to farmers, we actually talk about the issues that are exactly the same no matter which country you live in. Farmers are always concerned about pricing for their products, about succession, about the power of the retailers, and how retail margins always seem to be more than farmers' returns. When I start to go through all of the issues, we actually find that on 8 issues out of 10, we probably agree. And it's only the 2 that we need to resolve. And too often, I believe we focus on the issues where we may have some disagreement, when in actual fact we should also celebrate the areas where we have in common. So it's very good to have this dialogue today. Can I just reinforce the Ambassador's comments? New Zealand is a very small country right around on the other side of the world. It is challenging being on the other side of the world, but there are also a number of advantages. Maybe just for those of you who don't know as much about New Zealand, we're a very young country. We were only discovered in 1769. So when I look at the vast amount of history you have here in Egypt, of course, New Zealand is just a baby in terms of the world when we look at the age of our country. And so I think we are still evolving. 1769 is not very long ago, and we have evolved quite rapidly, and as you rightly point out, to being now one of the most competitive economies in the world. But we take a lot of pride in that, but we still think there's a lot of work to do. I just thought I would talk a little bit about New Zealand and agriculture, because it is very different to this part of the world. And for many people in Egypt, and I know how you have lots of areas of Egypt that is very dry, New Zealand is a country that actually does get a lot of rainfall. It's a long, narrow country. It's a country that only has about 11 million hectares of farmland, so not a big country in world terms, but a country that has a climate that does enable grass to grow year-round. We have winters that are cold, but not so cold as to be covered in snow for long periods of time. And so New Zealand is a country that has a grass-fed farming system. So our animals graze outside, they graze on pastures, and that does give us some advantages around cost in particular. The interesting thing about New Zealand is that our farmland is nearly all fully utilised. So there is really very little opportunity now for more farmland to be for more land to be brought into farming. And our challenges at home are that we need to make sure we don't over-intensify our farming and have negative consequences on the environment. So there's a lot of work and talk at home in New Zealand about how we can increase the value of our products that we sell offshore, because we will not be increasing the volume of our products from New Zealand exporting to the world. A lot of people think about New Zealand as a very large dairy producer. In actual fact, that's not the case. New Zealand is a small dairy producer in the world. We only have about 3% of global dairy production being produced in New Zealand. 20 billion litres of milk in the New Zealand dairy industry. And if we compare that to America, which is 5 times the size of New Zealand, at 100 billion litres, or Europe at 170 billion litres, in global terms, New Zealand is actually a small producer of dairy. But as the Ambassador pointed out, with only 4.6 million people, we export over 90% of all of the food we produce. So New Zealand is a small producer, and we've tried to work out how many people we could feed with all of New Zealand's food that we produce. And the estimate is about 40 million people total that New Zealand could feed with all of the food we produce. So again, New Zealand will never have ambitions to feed the world. New Zealand has ambitions to be a very competitive and efficient producer that can supply high-value products to the most discerning markets in the world. And I'll talk about the reforms that have taken us to where we are today. In 1985, the country in New Zealand was on its knees financially. the government had to make some very tough calls about how to reform our economy, because we were on the verge of effectively seeking funding from the World Bank just to keep New Zealand afloat. And the government decided that one of the areas that was most important to reform was agriculture. And up until that time, we had a lot of direct subsidies coming into farming that were incentivizing farmers to farm livestock in particular, like sheep and cattle. And the government in 1985 made a bold decision where overnight, in one day, they removed all support and subsidies for farming. Now, I won't pretend this was easy. This was a very difficult time in New Zealand. It had a large effect on small communities and rural communities. It was particularly tough for a number of our farmers, and a number of our smaller, inefficient farmers did not survive the reform period in 1985. But we've come through that very much stronger. It really only took us about 5 years to start to clear the effects of eliminating subsidies overnight, and the industry has gone on to be develop its competitiveness since then. So it was tough, but I don't meet a single farmer in New Zealand today that would go back to the time when the government was supporting us directly with subsidies. I just would like to add that I don't expect any other country in the world to do what New Zealand did in 1985. So please do not think that I'm coming into Egypt and suggesting that you should do the same here, because I understand it will not happen. I know, but what we can do is we can help people understand the effects of reforms, and how maybe other countries, when they reform their agriculture, how there are easier ways to do it over a longer period of time that might have the same effects. So please, I'm happy to answer any questions about those details afterwards. But what it also did make us do, and the ambassador pointed out, it made us realise we needed to specialise in doing what we do well. And it was about agriculture. We also had reforms at the time around imports, where import barriers were removed to make our economy very open. And we had labour market reforms, which actually have been very important in allowing and encouraging our economy to grow. So today we have an economy that is growing at the fastest rate in the developed world, at about 4% per annum. We have unemployment at under 5%. So we have an economy that is rapidly growing. I see this morning our finance minister announced a surplus of $1.5 billion. So we have a government that is operating with a current account surplus, and we have options. It's a very positive growth environment to be involved in. Those reforms have set off in farming and agriculture an incredible time of innovation amongst the people involved. So our farmers knew that when the government was no longer paying their wage, they had to be the most efficient farming business that they could possibly be. So in New Zealand now, the only returns our farmers receive are the returns from the products that are exported around the world. And sometimes that's not easy. When markets fall, farmers' incomes fall. When markets rise, farmers' incomes rise. But we have learned that we have to be very resilient. We have to be able to have a business that rides the ups and downs of the market. And we have to be very smart at being business people, because we are borrowing money with banks to actually keep us through the tough times, and then banking money in the good times. So it has turned our businesses into our farms, into much more efficient businesses. And we are talking multi-million-dollar businesses that are still largely family-owned and family-run. One of the things that has happened since the reforms has been the need and the development of a very, very good support service and professional sector around farming. And very often people come to New Zealand and they talk about how good our farmers are. And I say, actually, in my view, a large amount of the credit should go to the support and service and professional sectors around farming. So if you go into a small town in New Zealand today, you can buy all of the farm merchandise that you require on the day, all of the animal health and nutrition advice, all of the financial management advice, all of the insurance advice that you need from the town that is in your proximity. And it's a very, very important piece of the success of agriculture in New Zealand that is often misunderstood in the world. We also realised that with a country of only 4.6 million people that we needed to have access to markets around the world. And I know for you with Global Trade Matters, we talk in New Zealand about, for us, trade is our future. If we don't have access to markets, then frankly we do not have an economy in New Zealand, and for us global trade absolutely matters. Since 1985 we've had a very aggressive agenda to make sure that we have access to markets, and I know that you will understand that in agriculture and food it's one of the most sensitive aspects around trade and one of the most highly and heavily protected forms of trade in the world. One of my real concerns is that with the growth of services and IT and other business around the world, my concern is that these agricultural market access issues just keep getting pushed off into the too, we call it the too hard basket, too difficult to deal with. And so I spend a lot of my time in this role as New Zealand's Special Agricultural Trade Envoy talking about why agricultural trade matters, why food security should no longer be seen through the lens of self-sufficiency. We need to understand how a free trade in food and agricultural products can help countries secure the food for their people in a much more efficient way. But equally we understand the importance of some domestic food security. And so that is why we are very keen to try and work with countries to develop their domestic farming systems as well. Because we understand that food trade, agricultural trade and food products is actually much better if there's also domestic production as well. So we do have countries where we work with others to develop their own domestic farming and domestic systems, and I'll talk about that a bit later as we go. So it's not just about market access, it's also about being the very best in the world at food quality, about having food safety systems that are unquestioned in the world. It's about having agreements with sanitary and phytosanitary measures between countries where we can trade efficiently around the world without having to deal with non-tariff measures, which are becoming the new way of stopping food trade around the world. So we focus very much on quality and safety, the integrity of our production systems, the auditing and assurance that we provide to our customers around the world is crucially important if we are to be able to survive as an exporting economy. I just want to talk about the role of government with the changes that happened in 1985, because we moved it from a time where the government was very involved in our farming, where they effectively paid the wages of our farmers, and so then they set rules for farmers to abide by. And so once the government stopped paying our wages, then actually they let farmers get on with the business of farming. But they have also played a very important role in making sure the policy framework is right, that there are good policies to encourage innovation, that there is legislation in place for farmers to collectively come together and invest in research and development and innovation for farming, and skills and development and upskilling our farmers to make sure that they can continue to be innovative and efficient in the world today. So they played a very important role in a number of areas around market access, They will provide collaborative funding for research programs. But the important piece here is that they'll only fund a project if farmers have first decided they'll fund it themselves. So it'll be matching funding, but only if the farmers decide it's worthwhile to do by funding it also themselves. Biosecurity, of course, the government plays a very important role in biosecurity. I'm not sure how many people have been to New Zealand, but yeah, if you have, you will know that it is illegal to bring individual pieces of fruit in your baggage in through the customs in New Zealand, because we are so concerned that they might be carrying diseases we don't have in New Zealand. And I know it's tough sometimes. You can get fined for bringing an apple into New Zealand, but it's for us, our biosecurity is almost our greatest threat, because if we have diseases that come into our livestock sectors or our horticultural sectors, then that will stop us having access to markets at some stage in the future. We are lucky with the water surrounding us and being 2,000 kilometres away from our nearest neighbour, but still we need to be vigilant. And even today we have a rust virus that has appeared in New Zealand from Australia that's been blown over on the wind that we're fighting. I know myrtle rust that we're fighting today, and the Ministry for Primary Industries is leading the charge to try and eliminate that out of New Zealand. Food safety systems, the government has a very important role as the authoritative body to actually certify those food safety systems are right, and around assurance as well, not just on farm, but right through processing and the exporting sector. So what does this mean for the future of the relationship between Egypt and New Zealand? Well, I'm afraid I only arrived in Egypt late last night, and so I am very new to Egypt on my first visit. But the ambassador and his team have provided some very good briefing notes, and I can see already that the relationship here is strong. We have $500 million New Zealand dollars of trade coming into Egypt. There's the opportunity for us to develop much more together, I'm sure, with our exporting and our farming systems, and to form greater partnerships in this part of the world. So I will have more answers after our visits today, because as we talked about earlier, this is not just a one-way exchange. We will learn about the livestock sector this afternoon. We'll talk to some of your farmers, and certainly we're keen to hear your views about how we can work together more in the future. But I would just reinforce an important point. And we've just had 3 days in Algeria. We have people here that are based in Dubai, so they're covering the UAE and the Middle East in this part of the world. There are other countries in Africa that we are looking to do more with. And I have to say, I'm almost embarrassed to say that in New Zealand, this part of the world is not well understood about New Zealand. So part of my message when I go home is to reinforce just how important this is for New Zealand, this part of the world, and that we should be doing more work together. So please, I look forward to the suggestions and the comments, and I'm very keen to stop there so we can get the discussion underway.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a fantastic opportunity for both suggestions, comments, questions, and please feel free not just directing the questions to the front of the room, but we have a lot of representatives from Riyadh, from Pretoria, from Addis Ababa as well, from the New Zealand embassies there, so please do feel free to ask as many questions as you can, make as many suggestions, and I think I'm going to take the first comment, just a comment that I want to make, and you're going to see this because you arrived late last night, so you saw Cairo being pretty.
Yes,
and
beautiful.
You're going to see Cairo busy today, and you're going to travel around, and you're going to notice something really phenomenal, because we're this country that is now trying to, how can I say, go out to the desert and create new farming lands, the 1.5 million faddans. But in the meantime, our actual agricultural land that built Egypt over the past 7,000 years has now turned into sort of urban communities, so on and so forth, which is really quite sad. But that is, again, scarcity of water, is very, very important. I lived in Australia.
Yes.
And I've been as far down to Launceston, Tasmania. So, and I've seen these agricultural lands and the nature that you have there that creates all of this lush, beautiful agricultural produce. It's very, very different here in Egypt. And in your opinion, with partners that New Zealand has been helping with technical assistance at least, and especially like Saudi Arabia, what was the approach in terms of that lack and scarcity of water resources for larger farming communities?
Yes, it's a very good question, because in New Zealand we always talk about the fact that we don't have a water shortage issue, but we have a water storage issue. So we have 96% of the rainfall that falls on New Zealand flows directly to the sea without being captured or stored for any economic use. And I think that is because we're a country that does have abundance of water. Having said that, in my area, where I farm, we are a very dry region. We grow a lot of grapes in my region, and when the season's very good for the grapes and the wine growers, it's not good for the farmers, the livestock farmers. So we have areas of New Zealand that do get very dry, and we are spending a lot of time in talking about how we can be more efficient with our water in New Zealand, and we are putting water storage projects in for irrigation. So I would have to say that's probably not our area of expertise. But the area of expertise in countries like Saudi and through Southeast Asian countries where we are working as well is around genetics, animal genetics, around nutrition and animal husbandry, animal health and nutrition. We have a lot of our veterinarians that are spending a lot of time in that part of the world around reproductive efficiency for livestock, making sure that we do have healthy and performing animals, and then also the processing and exporting sector, helping develop that as well. So I just wouldn't mind just adding one more thing that happened after 1985 in New Zealand, and it is quite relevant when you talked about the housing that is on some of your prime agricultural land. And we probably didn't realise it in 1985. We didn't realise that government support and subsidies do not incentivize the best use of land. And we had sheep grazing on a lot of our drier country in New Zealand because farmers were paid per head to actually farm sheep in those regions. And when subsidies were removed, farmers realised the best use of that dry land was not sheep farming, but it was growing grapes for wine production. And we now have some of the finest Syrahs coming out of my region in the world from an area called the Gimlet Gravels that was once farming sheep, but land use has now been able to move to its best and most efficient use because of the removal of government support. So we have urbanisation as well on some of our best land, but we're now thinking much more carefully about how to make sure that doesn't impact on food production.
What is New Zealand's strategy moving forward? Like His Excellency was saying, and you reinforce this, you've got very limited amount of land,
yes,
and you've got this amazing expertise. What is the strategy beyond export? I mean, investment in agriculture outside of New Zealand. Australia is obviously your first, would be your first choice, but where else does New Zealand look for expansion of its agricultural land bank in a sense?
Yes, we're not really looking to increase our land area. It's really for us is about value, increasing the value for our products. Whether it's in the dairy industry, it's not just about fresh milk. It's about how do we actually break down the milk and make the most out of the components of milk. In the meat industry, we have in New Zealand a lot of research around how we can more efficiently utilise the co-products and the byproducts around bones and gels, around blood products. How can we actually maximise the value for the healthcare industry from livestock industry? So in the wine industry, we focus very much on value. It is not about bulk production of wine from New Zealand. It has to be at the higher end. And now we have companies that are investing offshore And probably one of the biggest drivers has been in the horticultural sector, for example, where we have counter-seasonal production. So kiwi fruit being produced in New Zealand in our season, and then kiwi fruit being produced in Italy in their season. Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, to provide fruit that can be available all year round. So we generally tend to do that. Our company's in partnership with local producers in other parts of the world. As I say, New Zealand does not, we're a small country, we do not have a lot of money, and we don't have the ability to go and buy large tracts of land around the world.
Right. But again, it's a technical know-how
It
and
is.
the experience that really what we're looking for. Your Excellency, may I give you the floor? We can use one microphone here. That's easier on the
Well, good morning. I really would like to commend you for inviting the colleagues from New Zealand, and because I will say why New Zealand is very particular. But let me go very quickly through history. You said that New Zealand was discovered in 1769. I have a colleague who was a minister several times in Tanzania of science and environment and all that. And he said, when they used to ask us in the school, who discovered Lake Victoria? We say Livingstone. And oh my God, now I discovered that I'm not good, I am stupid, because our village was in Lake Victoria. He was indigenous to the Lake Victoria. Therefore, the Maoris in New Zealand were there before you came.
That's right.
Anyhow, it's why New Zealand mattered for us. It's an example of dynamic repositioning, because the conditions I lived in the UK in years whereby UK was joining the European Union, and there was great frustration in New Zealand. The low park butter is not going to be sold, the mutton, and etc., and you have to renegotiate this. But during the years, I mean, your effort in 1996 to reposition and to take subsidy and to do all sorts of things, you have repositioned and moved forward. But for my colleagues who are here from Egypt, or businessmen who worked in Egypt, why you have succeeded? Because you had the K, you have the knowledge, you had a strong research center, as well as universities in New Zealand, and link to the research community for science, which take this and transform this to innovations. That's why you succeeded. Because the delinking of knowledge to sustainable development element, and the major elements is that you have to have institutions, you have to have regulations, as well as policies, and inject science into the agricultural sector to make a difference. Then you look to have link with the markets are very important. But the future is there for New Zealand, because if you look at the future whereby we are going with the climate change and all that, there will be a massive decrease in agricultural productivity, which will be about 40% by year 2050. And whoever had water, I mean, never mind about the water which is going to the sea, but the water which you have, its optimum use of water in New Zealand will allow you to maintain your exportation. But more valuable than this is the element which you have asked, the question you asked, what else? What else is agricultural systems and management techniques? You can transfer this to countries in partnership. In a country like Egypt, we had a strategy for 2030 by year 2010 for agriculture in particular. And we had highlighted what is good for Egypt at that time. It's not good for us to produce animals which consume a lot of water. Therefore, we will focus only on small ruminant and milk, but not in meat requirements. Therefore, partnership with Egypt in the meat production is very important. Technology in the milk processing and other aspects of dairy will be very important. And by that, I think I will stop here. But of course, you have 11 million hectares to use in agricultural development. we only have 8 million acres, which are about 2.8 million hectares. And in the desert, we have developed in the past 30 years, we have developed 2 million acres, but this is included in the 8. And therefore, we don't have much land, but we have to feed and clothe out of this land about 95 million people, at least. And the challenge is great for agriculture in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. A point Mike that was making on the last point that you said, a country doesn't necessarily have to be self-sufficient through its agricultural product. I think if I understood you well, I mean, this is a question that we need to ask ourselves here in Egypt. You know, it's sort of like Iceland, like Finland, that moved from agriculture to industry at one point. But what was really interesting at the conference His Excellency attended with us in March, we had Hisham Al-Khazindar, who is the managing director and one of the founders at Al-Qala Holdings, and they own Dina Farms. They have quite an interesting portfolio, and he talked about, again, the dynamics of the dairy industry specifically, and I sat with Yasser at Nestle talking about this as well, that a company like Dina Farms now is expanding its farms because they believe now it will make more sense for them to produce locally and distribute locally than to import from New Zealand. Now, how does New Zealand position itself knowing that this is something that consequently will happen, which may reduce our dependency on importation from New Zealand? Might not affect your bottom line as a country, but again, it is a very big market. I believe we are either the second after Britain and before Russia, or vice versa, but we are the second importer of dairy products from New Zealand. Another issue that we have, and this is a discussion that I was having with people at Nestle as well, was the powdered baby formula milk, that we have a very big gap in between supply and demand here in Egypt as well. So all of these different approaches that are consequential of floating the Egyptian pound, how does New Zealand have a long-term vision of dealing with this, specifically in a country as large as Egypt?
It's a good question. I might just get one of the gentlemen that's here from Fonterra just to clarify the volumes, because I know certainly not the second largest export destination for New Zealand. What are we?
I think you maybe butter is particularly.
Oh, butter. For butter. Yes, yeah, that's right. No, that's right too.
We're the 20th, I think.
That's right. So we've always taken the view that that if domestic production grows in countries and there is no longer a need for imports, then frankly that is life. We say c'est la vie, that is life. But we've always found that in actual fact, domestic demand growth normally outstrips the ability for domestic supply to meet that demand. So there are always requirements for imported products in most countries in the world. You have 100 million people here. And so we are certainly obviously happy to work with you to help develop some domestic production here if that is of interest, but we don't see that as necessarily being a threat to our ability to import into this country or any other country in the world. So it's not, again, we can't, remember, we don't have aspirations to feed the world. We have a small amount of dairy production in global terms that we produce, and there are markets that are crying out for that all around the world. So we would love to keep supplying Egypt, but if that doesn't happen, then I guess we'll have other markets that we should look at. Sorry, Dave, did you want to add anything to that? We have David Richmond here from Fonterra. This is our largest cooperative in New Zealand. So maybe just to add to that.
Yeah, thank you. I'd echo Mike's comments. So we're very aware that across the world markets change and domestic production increases, and we certainly don't see that as a threat to us either. So our strategy very much across different markets has been to partner and trying to add value to milk domestically. So we've done that through parts of Europe, we've done it through parts of the Middle East, and we have some incredibly strong relationships in Egypt as well with our customers. So as market changes, as a company, we seek to adapt That's where we start to take our technical expertise to try and add value to that domestic market as it grows. And then we send our products elsewhere if the need's no longer here. But what we typically see, as Mike mentioned, that the domestic demand typically tends to outstrip the supply anyway, and that as a product from New Zealand, there is a need and a desire for a New Zealand dairy-specific market. So maybe it starts to become more niche, but we can then also certainly start to help develop the domestic market. So.
Good morning, everybody. Your Excellency, Mike, Ashraf, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nivan Mortagi. I'm from Banque du Caire. I'm the head of corporate business development. In case you don't know, this is the Central Bank of Egypt. This week is our Financial Inclusion Week, which is aiming to reach all underbanked segments of the Egyptian market. And in our experience, I'm not really sure what's the experience in New Zealand, but definitely agriculture is one of those segments where we're not doing nearly enough. So what I'm curious is, from your experience, are there specific financial products that we should be looking at to create for the agricultural sector? Do your farmers have issues also with access to finance? And I'm not talking about, there is an agricultural development bank. I'm talking about commercial banks. Yeah. And at the same time, do you have any specific advice that you'd like to give for commercial banks of how to do more outreach to reach this segment? And thank you.
Thank you very much. And happy birthday. Thank you. Yes, yeah. The banking sector in New Zealand plays a very, very important role for our farming. And we have a sector in New Zealand that actually is not afraid to borrow money from commercial banks. In fact, in our dairy industry, the average equity across the sector among dairy businesses is only about 60% equity, and the rest of it is financed from commercial borrowings. In the sheep and beef sector, sheep and cattle sector, the equity is 80%. And about 20% is financed through commercial banks. And that is, the difference there largely is because the earnings in the sheep and beef sector are lower than if you're a dairy farmer. But they play a very, very important role. And as I said earlier, because we rely on the market returns only, there will be years when our farmers have losses and they have to actually be able to sustain those through borrowings from the bank. The banks are very embedded in our local communities. They have rural managers that are out visiting farmers all the time. They sit down with farmers to do budgets for the year ahead, make sure that those budgets are reviewed and adjusted for price differences and price changes. They also play an important role in understanding farmers' costs and how they can actually be more efficient on cost management. So a banking partner in agriculture in New Zealand is very much a business partner. And they will often sit in on the meetings with owners, talking about the year ahead and 5 years ahead and what the future looks like with succession in 10, 20, 30 years' time. So it's a very, very strong partnership. Maybe just for context, borrowing rates in New Zealand at the moment for farmers, interest rates are between 5 and 7.5%. So I'm not sure how that compares to Egypt. No, I saw the inflation rate yesterday, so at about 30.4%.
The central bank lending rate is 15.75.
Yes, yeah.
That's the basic rate.
Yeah.
Without adding, the margin.
So our central bank rate is about 2%. Yeah, about 2% in New Zealand central. So and that is a benefit of a sort of a strong and stable economy. No, it hasn't been. No, so maybe it might be of interest. And after the removal of subsidies in 1987, I was paying 24% interest on farm borrowings. So, and we had rampant inflation, and so that was a particularly tough time. So we now have in New Zealand, we are frightened of inflation. We don't ever want to go back to the days where we had, rampant inflation. I know that's a bit of a challenge here. But so anyway, the banks are very, very important, and we actually do involve them very closely in our businesses.
Just to follow up on her question, and maybe I'll take a comment from CIB as well on this regarding microfinance, for example. Do you have is your market built in a sense on microfinance for small farmers, or is it more of larger corporations in New Zealand?
Just clarify, microfinance, when you...
Lending small farmers, 1 acre or 2 acres. I mean,
no, that's... yes, yeah.
Co-op most probably, a lot of co-ops do this here in Egypt, but there's a lot of commercial banks that want to get into that. But when we talk to banks like CIB and others, they say, smaller farmers are much higher risk, so it's very, very difficult to go down and be able to collect this money and to do that. So, that's one part that our commercial banks still see very high risk, and we have view for risk today. So maybe if you could just comment on that, how a commercial bank looks at small farmers in Egypt. Is that a better structure than having large farms like Dina Farm and the Sekams and the larger ones, if that's possible?
Regarding your question, the small farmers, they're not really bankable per se by commercial banks. It's more not really risk rating. It's also because of the lack of education, and as you said, this is the Financial Inclusion Week. We're trying to reach out, but it's challenging, and we've got a lot of homework to do in this area.
We have initiated in Egypt a fund. It's called the Agriculture Research for Development Fund. And this was about 1.2 billion Egyptian pound. And we asked CIB to manage this fund. And in this fund, we had a council which used to look and judge the proposals which is coming. And we had 13 banks in Egypt working with CIB, but CIB was leading this for years, and still is. The fund is not as active as it was before. And this fund, when we initiated, we had the National Bank of Egypt was the second biggest one, and surprisingly, the Agriculture Credit Bank was about 3 or 4. But anyhow, they have really funded 2 teams. There was lending for more than $5 million for companies and big entrepreneurs in the agro industry in Egypt. But meanwhile, we decided in the board that half of the fund goes to small farmers, the 1 acre and more. And to be able to do this without collaterals, we had asked the cooperatives to work with them, and they were really supporting them. And therefore, we have moved. It was about half of the lending portfolio was going to small farmers and small entrepreneurs and young people who would like to be in this business. The whole experience is in CIB, and CIB could bring this about because this was a wonderful example. I talk about it internationally because it was wonderful effort to bring the private sector and 13 bank organized by CIB to do something in agricultural research, and we were aiming at total reform within the context of the strategy. Sorry for taking all that time. Thank you.
So that's very interesting, and it's very similar to many countries in the world where I visit, where there's a lot of concern about how the small farmers are looked after. And so in New Zealand, there is no just given right to farm. You do not just have the right to farm in New Zealand and to be financially viable. At the end of the day, you have to be commercially viable. Doesn't matter how big you are or how small you are. And so where we have farmers in New Zealand on what we call lifestyle blocks or small farms, then they will be working off farm and supplementing their income from a job that they might have in the town or city that they live next to. So We do not have any support for small farmers just because they are small farmers. They have to be commercially viable. And that has led to some aggregation of farmland. And certainly we've seen across all of our livestock sectors in particular, farms becoming larger in scale and more efficiently growing as well.
What is the level of education of your average farmer?
The question was, what is the level of education for average farmers in New Zealand? We still have a large range of education. We have education from people that have been through universities, and certainly the university sector has been a very important part of helping develop agriculture in New Zealand. So we have people that have degrees and high qualifications, but equally we have people that leave school and learn farming by working with other farmers. In fact, some of the very best farmers that I see are the people that actually have it's in here, it's in their heart. And so that is often, I still think, some of the best way for farmers, to learn how to farm is actually by farming it themselves.
But at the same time, you could look, sorry.
Yes.
Can you hear me? We see that in Egypt as well. It travels. It goes from one generation to the next. But there is this knowledge base that is lacking. So when a farmer in somebody in New Zealand will leave school to go and learn,
Yes.
Do they have that knowledge base, or are they just following? Are they just following the pattern that they've seen?
Yes. Yeah, there's a combination. They've been taught by the farmers that are on the farm. So the young people coming in will be taught by the farmers on the farm. So that experience and knowledge is passed on. And New Zealand farmers are very generous with their time and their knowledge to the younger generation. But there are also on-farm training courses that they can also be enrolled in. So they can actually learn while they're earning. While they're working on the farm, they might spend one day a week in the classroom. They might be doing on-farm training with tutors and teachers that come onto the farms as well. So there's a very wide range of education on-farm, through training providers, and then also into universities.
Who sources these on-farm trainings?
Yeah, the person wanting to learn actually sources it themselves. Yeah, and it has to be paid for. So we do not have a free education sector in New Zealand. We have to pay for that ourselves, even though it is in part subsidised by the government. But my children at university now are borrowing money to go to university, and that's something they would have to pay off later in life.
I ask these questions because what we tend to see here are agricultural practices themselves are not very efficient. There's a lot of waste of resources, and for a country like Egypt that is already has a lot of scarcity in their resources, this is, in my opinion, one of the greatest challenges that we're facing.
And maybe that's, I can't emphasise enough how when the government no longer pays your wages, there's a mindset change. You change your mind about how important it is to be efficient and innovative. So new ideas are developed very quickly in New Zealand. New methods of livestock grazing, new methods of new pastures and forages. So we have a lot of our traditional ryegrass pasture in New Zealand is moving to herbs like plantain and chicory that are very high performing and have medicinal properties as well. So there are the what I'd call the hotbed of innovation is very much alive, and new farmers want to learn and they want to be at the leading edge of all those new technologies. And the new generation with cell phone devices and with sensors and modelling is very, very exciting.
Thank Thank you. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Sharif Al-Alfi. I work at the American University in Cairo for the Research Institute for Sustainable Development. The model we are one model we are implementing right now is in the governorate of Fayoum. I don't know how long you're in Egypt, but there's a lot to see here. We found that personally, when I speak to farmers, I can't get into a long-term. I can't speak about long-term plans. We're looking at 6 months ahead. We're looking at the harvest. We're looking at the next season, because there's such a high risk. Not high risk, but they're just so limited in their resources. So we found that a model that might work is to actually build a model farm. We're working on integrated farming right now, reusing water. So, for example, the water that they're using from the canal to irrigate, we do canal lining just to get the flow of water increasing, and then that goes into a fish pond in our model, and then the added fish is an added product, and then that water goes to irrigate the vegetables. So we're just trying to create this model. It's always a 1 acre farm to show that no matter how small your land is, you can look at a diversity, diversifying, your portfolio, and reusing your resources. That's really what we're focused on. And the objective is that farmers might be able to see something that actually works, and then go ahead and implement it without that risk.
Well done.
We have a question in the back, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Iman Al-Hadari from Rise Egypt, and my question is particularly around the support system that you have talked about that accompanied the removal of subsidies, because everyone thinks that removal of subsidy is the solution. But I would love if you could give us more insights about what kind of reforms, about labor reforms and other reforms that you have done, and the support system that accompanied the removal of subsidies in New Zealand.
We may not have been perfect in the way that we remove subsidies, and I talked earlier about the fact that removing subsidies overnight without thinking about what comes next is maybe not such a good idea, and that's effectively what we did. So it wasn't. Now, my personal view is that actually often that's the best way to get change, but it comes with some real challenges and difficulties. So I think we went through a period after 1985 where we were really we had to stop and say, what next? And that is why we literally had a time in New Zealand's farming history where the government was effectively out of our lives. And I think now we've learned that over the last 20 odd years, we've learned how to work together with the government much more, I think, constructively than we did at about that time in 1985. Because excuse me, in 1985, there was always arguments between the government and farmers, and now we know how important it is to work together. So trust me, the ambassador and all the officials that are here are not just officials. For us, they are a very important part of our ability to succeed in the world today, and so we need to work with them. I don't know that I've got too much more to add about the government support, but it really, I'll give you some examples maybe which might just help. I talked a bit earlier about the ability of farmers to fund their own research. So one of the pieces of legislation that was put in place was a piece of legislation called the Commodity Levies Act. And this is a generic piece of legislation where individual sector groups can come together to fund their own needs. So it allows, for example, Dairy New Zealand, Beef and Lamb New Zealand, an organisation from the horticultural sector to collect levies off their farmers. So you know levy, you know what levy is? Yeah, levy off your farmers, and then to develop long-term strategies about the things that were important for each sector. And so those organisations that are owned by farmers, run by farmers, then take some of that money to the government, and they make an application for a research project, for example, and maybe reproductive technologies that can then be qualified for some government funding. Okay, but it's very much farmer and grower led. And the government will only come on board if the farmers and growers believe it's in the right area to focus on for the long-term success of the sector. So that is maybe one example. I talked about the market access, trade and market access agenda, very important. You know, the individual farmers cannot do that themselves. It needs us to work with the government and our ministers and negotiators to make sure we have access to markets. The Ministry for Primary Industries, we have Dave Samuels down the back here who works for Ministry for Primary Industries. They play a very important role around ensuring the products have equivalent status in markets where we can, to make sure we have access into markets. We don't get tripped up with barriers around labelling requirements and food safety systems and assurance. So, you know, the Ministry for Primary Industries, our Ministry for Agriculture is a very important piece of the jigsaw as well. On-farm assurance through the food safety systems. So it's not direct involvement, but it is providing the support, the assurance, and that stamp of integrity that our exporting companies and cooperatives need to be successful in the world today. So I'm not sure I've added too much, but you know, it is very much around the edges, but it's a very, very important, we'd say a very, very important piece in the jigsaw. Farmers can't do this themselves. The government and farmers and exporters need to work together.
Mr. Anderson, I'd like to get you involved in the discussion as well. You know, you've taught us a lot because you're on the ground, and we've always talked about efficiency of the Egyptian agricultural sector and some of the challenges that we face, small farmers, specifically access to finance, but most importantly, you know, this whole concept that we lose so much of our post-harvest, just very simply because of the way that we manage our storage, our transportation, even the way that we actually, you know, pick the crops and harvest them. And you've done great things in that very specific area, bringing those post-harvest losses down from, you know, they were as high as 60% at one point, and you've been able to bring these down, becoming more efficient. So if you can talk to us a little bit about that and maybe add to it, what are the Egyptian products that, you know, we still export to New Zealand? Mm-hmm. So, you know, yeah, there are fruits, I believe, and things to that extent. How can we increase that, considering the fact that we have this amazing environment for all year-round tomatoes, all year-round strawberries, so we can work on a lot of the off-seasons, which you've done with Europe and the United States under the QIZ or the General System of Preferences. But how can we take advantage of the New Zealand market on some of the products they don't have? In the meantime, what can we learn from them in terms of experience in innovation, bringing those post-harvest losses down?
Well, thank you, Ashraf. I'm Doug Anderson, and I'm managing partner of Anderson Associates International, and our brand in Egypt is Forza Opportunity. And I've been here 18 years, a little longer, going on 19, and I've worked throughout the agricultural sector in Egypt. We took the food processors to market here initially. I worked with them for 6 years, and we increased their exports from $62 million to $3 billion, and the fresh pack went from 26 million to 1.7 billion. It's up over 2 billion now. I've always believed, and Yasser can vouch for this, I'm a real believer in Egypt's agribusiness opportunity here. And when you look at the resources, the physical resources that Egypt has, and it's got 36 microclimates, for instance. They've got tremendous counter-season opportunities in Europe. They've got 1.3 billion consumers in the area that they can feed into. And so there's no lack of opportunity here for Egypt. The problem is that it's fragmented. The agricultural community is very, very, very fragmented. 90% of the farmers own 3 fadan or less, and they keep dividing up their land, as sons are born, and so that's a problem. But access to credit was discussed here. I see no real future in terms of banks lending to small farmers for a variety of reasons. Everybody knows those reasons. There's a lack of collateral. They don't have this habit of borrowing and repaying. We run into a situation where people are anxious to take the money, and then they look for a lot of reasons not to repay it. And so, that's a real issue. We've got this, what I call the Galabea Mafia. We've got these traders that work with the farmers that provide that capital. And so they'll fund that initial, crop then. And then I've had conferences with a number of farmers associations, cooperatives. And when I do the math on the board in front of these 50, 60, 70 small farmers, I'm here to tell you, they break out in tears, because once they understand how much of a discount they're paying to borrow that money from these traders, that's what they are. And they're the only ones in the village that are driving a Mercedes, by the way, And so you've got this Galabea Mafia that takes advantage of these small farmers. And I think that the solution to that is to work with the buyers, not the traders, but the buyers, and do value chain financing. And we've implemented that. We did a supply chain contract with Heinz Corporation. We enlisted 8,500 farmers on 10,500 acres of tomatoes. And so what we did is we worked with the processors to provide the inputs for those farms. So we had associations that we worked with to buy, we figured out the entire needs for a crop for an association, maybe 250 or 600 farmers, and we would buy those chemicals, the fertilizers, the pesticides, whatever, in bulk, and then they would store that and then sell it out to the farmers, and they'd take a 3% commission. And at the same time, they would satisfy one of the restrictions for global gap, and that was storing those pesticides and chemicals in a way that are accountable. They kept a chain of custody. They kept the records, but there are solutions. And so processors bought the shotlas, the seedlings, gave them to the farmers. The price of those were then discounted when the processors bought the products. It wasn't just a tomato project, because you have to rotate a solanaceous crop. And so we had a number of crops that we used as rotational crops with these farmers too. And it was all very, very successful. But the problem is these were USAID funded, and all of these projects have a beginning and an end. And so what you have sitting on the sidelines are opportunists that watch what's going on, and as soon as you turn off the lights on a project, then they invade. They're predators, is what they are, and so it's going to take a real effort here, I think. And the other problem here is that farmers have, you have this Nasser legacy here. Every time they have a problem, they think that the government has to bail them out. And so that has to change as well. And it will change, and we've seen it change when you put money in their pocket. And I think that's the key to getting them successful. But this lack of information that somebody mentioned is another real problem here. I don't think, and I don't mean to be derogatory about the Ministry of Agriculture, Dr. Adel, but you've got a lot of people in the Extension Service that just are out there collecting their pay, and they're not providing information to the farmers. We found when we started working with the farmers that they really didn't have the information they needed to be successful. And so we started working with them, and it made a huge change. I mean, when we started the tomato project, the baseline was 15 tons per fadan. That was their yield. And so we doubled that over the course of this 5-year project. It was actually 4. The last year was grants, but we doubled that, and we would have tripled it if it hadn't been for the Tuta absoluta, the tomato leaf miner that invaded Egypt. It just devastated the crops. But we had a farmer that reported 82 tons per fadan. We had several in the 70s. We had a number in the 60s. We had one association in Nuberea that averaged 52 tons per acre. And if you look at California, which is one of the largest tomato producers in the world, their average, and they have the scale, they have economies of scale, they're mechanized, they have large farmlands, and they still average 49 tons per acre. And so the Egyptian farmer is capable. If you give him the information, they are capable. And so I've got a lot of notes here I could go over, but I don't want to hog the microphone. But I just firmly believe that there's a tremendous opportunity here in Egypt, particularly for exports, because if you overlay the opportunities in Europe with their capacity and capabilities here in Egypt, it'll just absolutely blow you away. I mean, the counter-season opportunities from Egypt to Europe are just tremendous for a variety of crops, actually. And so I'm not up to snuff on the trade flow, the trade data between Egypt and New Zealand. I haven't looked at it, but I understand that there's actually a surplus here with, well, there wouldn't be because of the milk powder, but Egypt has done a good job of getting into the marketplace, market entry in New Zealand, and I'm sure there's a lot of room for growth as well. But I would say access to credit is the main problem here. Fragmented farms and predators taking advantage of those farmers is another huge problem.
Can I just ask a question? Because I always say never underestimate the ability of farmers to do, to adopt new technologies and to really pick up new ideas when they understand, the solution that's in front of them. So, and they're very good at that. So when you did the work with your farmers, and you saw the increase in yields and the increased returns, but then you said the project stopped, and then the predators come back in. Why is that? Why didn't they understand that if they carried on doing it as they, as you demonstrated, that they could be commercially successful?
Well, actually, some of them do, and so you just do it. It's an incremental process, is what it is. But you've got the local guy with the trader that jumps in there and and waves some pounds under their nose, and then they just, because farmers have they've always paid off debt from this year's harvest, and it's no different any place in the world, and so it's an incremental process.
So it is working in part.
It is, yeah. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I mean, you look at the tomatoes in Esna. There's 200,000 hectares of tomatoes in Upper Egypt. We only worked with 8,500 farmers, and so you just got, you're just kind of picking. You're picking is what you're doing. You're not getting out to everybody.
One of the things that's been very successful in farming in New Zealand has been the formation of what we call discussion groups or focus groups amongst farmers. So, farmers learn best by seeing, success from other farmers. And so, by putting these groups together, we're very open about our financials on farm in New Zealand. So, we do a lot of financial analysis, a lot of benchmarking. We understand what the top 10% are doing financially. We can compare our numbers on a like-for-like basis, and then through discussion groups and learning from others. You know, that's been a very important part of the ecosystem back in New Zealand. So, you know, national databases with full financials, with the ability to actually understand, you know, what your performance is relative to others has been a key part of the move.
We did that, Mike. We did that, obviously, and we introduced the concept of crop budgets to these farmers and got them to. They knew, you know, they knew what they were spending. They just hadn't written it down, and they didn't have anything to benchmark against. And so these guys are. I'm here to tell you, when we started working with them, and we got some. You know, working on, we got about 25% of our farmers took it to traceability to satisfy those 25% of the processors that needed traceability. And there's a lot of things that we did with them, and it was very, you know, I was so gratified when you go out on a farm. We had model farms, and you go out there and you'd ask to see their records. They reach up into the palm tree and they take the ring binder down and they show you all of their records, you know. So they're capable, no question about it. They're savvy. They really are. They just need to give them the opportunity.
Please, go ahead.
Well, when we hear examples like this, and when we hear what you are saying about the support of the government or lack of it, where is the government institution? The government is only one institution of many in the scale of food chain. You have cooperatives, you have the private sector, you have a small farmer, you have the trades, you have linking farmer to market and how this process will work, logistics, regulations as well. And therefore, in Egypt, we have, when we sketched out this strategy in 2010, we were talking about total reform, a dynamic transformation of Egyptian agriculture to meet the challenges regionally and globally. And what sorts of linkages of knowledge, how we can upscale successful programs like the one you heard about it here. It's a matter, you cannot do this without reforming the institutions. And we were asking in this strategy, the first reform which should happen is in the government. We were going to restructure the whole of the Ministry of Agriculture. We're talking about it. I mean, lack of extension service. How these new modules will be built up to link the farmer to knowledge. How we are going to do this. And then enabling environment for the farming community, especially the small farm. Enabling environment is not a talk. It has to be embedded in legislation. Law which will give him the rights to do something. The right that he will live and be insured for his crops and his family as well. And therefore, it's a matter of, it hits the livelihood of this farm. In addition to this, we were concerned about how this process is going to take place without enormous amount of effort to link the farmer to proper finance. And forget about these collaterals, how we can have a new system to allow the farmers to have finance without the people with the galabia which you mentioned. And therefore, you have to meet the needs and requirements of this farmer. You mentioned something which is very good. It's a participatory approach to the farmers, rather than dictating. It's not bottom up. It's not bottom up or you just or nothing. It's just a matter of listening to them, empower them, let them feel the ownership of the programs they are doing. And then we talk about USAID programs. It was wonderful programs. We had one of the biggest programs of USAID in agriculture, $300 million program. And it was wonderful, it was successful and so on. But it's the day after, not the bomb, the day after is very important. And that you cannot ensure the day after for any sustainable agriculture with injection of innovation and a proper transformation without legislation as well as transformation of the institutions, including the cooperatives. Therefore, we were seeking to have a new law for cooperatives. For the first time, we had a law in end of 2004, which will give the cooperative the ability to earn income. Then they were for profit for the first time, because all the laws in Egypt from the old era was that the cooperatives is not for profit, they cannot have income. We allow them as well to form their own companies and to gain profit and so on. I'm just giving some examples of many, but it's a matter of process of transformation which has to take place in legislation, institutions, policy, to enable agriculture to move forward. Thank you.
As an Indian company investing in Egypt in this specific sector, what are your experiences? Quickly, challenges versus opportunities. Again, with the concept that a lot of foreign companies that are invested in Egypt are still having some difficulties of bringing their money out. But you're one of the people I always talk to and say, you know, we don't need to take our money out of Egypt. We are reinvesting in Egypt. I see that trend with a lot of Indian investors in Egypt. But what are your experiences that you can share with us in that respect?
Thanks, Ashraf. My name is Raman Sigal. I represent a private sector seed company. We are research and development company in Egypt. We have been here since 1993 and have only invested every day in Egypt. Yes, it is true that even as a company, when we go to the banks say, no, we can't give you a loan because it's not in the charter. Okay, fine, don't give us the money. We bring our own investors' money. We are the largest seed company, and I appreciate all kind of comments that were going on. I was anyways going to snatch the mic from you. I said I want to make it. First thing is that, okay, whatever happened is happened in the past. We need to look at how to create sustainability through the future, because water is not a finite source, and Egypt, unlike New Zealand, does not have rain. We depend on the Nile, which flows next to this hotel. The dams get built up, other things happen, so we have to be innovative, technology-driven to the farmers in Egypt, how to sustain their future. Growth of population, I've seen 2% over years, and this population is the biggest competitor against the small population that we have. Whatever we grow in this country, we eat up, okay? Very little is left to export. Then is market accessibility. I was in the fields 2 days ago. Except dealing with the dust in the villages, you don't deal with anything else, okay? So I think the roads, the network, the infrastructure has to be there to save what is farms producing. My personal experience, I tell you that I'm very happy. I've been here for 15 years in Egypt, and should I have life of another 15 years, I will spend it in Egypt. I'm not going away, okay? And we love to be here, and we want to invest in every day in the farming community to make sure that future is secure. It's not what happened in the past. If we failed in the past, why should we not look in the future? We want to be a company here in Egypt who want to invest in the future development of Egypt. And to the young lady, farmers are not stupid, okay? Farmers are well educated, and maybe they're totally illiterate, but they know what they want. I use the same thing, Galabaya. Farmers come to my distribution network in the Galabaya with the bag of the seed that we supply. I only want this seed because they look for reliability. If you sell quality with reliability to the farming community, the future lies with the country. I'm very sad to see that a lot of housing gets developed on the very good lands. We need to work on legislation. Dr. Biltagi has said there used to be legislation not to build anything on farming land. It gets built now. Population erupts, people have to live somewhere. Everybody comes close to Cairo or Alexandria to make their living, and people have to be housed. We have to think holistic approach. That's where the government has to make very good step. Yes, money is available. We know it's not subsidy. We talked about subsidy. By devaluating the currency and taking the subsidy out of the petroleum, there's already substantial amount of subsidy taken off from the farming. Have the farmers not survived? Farmers have survived. If the Galabaya mafia does not support, who will support the farming? Banks don't support, microfinance is not available. Where the money is to come for farming? So question is between having to do something or not to do at all anything. So my hat's off to the Egyptian farmers, economy. Whatever the government has done now, I think it is not wrong. It was needed long time ago to realize where do we stand. Will the things shake out well? I still have faith in Egypt and Egyptian farmers. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. On another note, and I think which is very, very important, we have the advantage to have somebody here from the World Wildlife Fund. I'm Naguib from Washington, D.C., Senior Communications Officer, and it's good that you're here with us listening to what we're talking about in terms of, all of this agriculture. I know that the WWF is very focused on that. So what is your take on what is happening right now in Egypt, and what does the World Wildlife Fund usually look for when we are developing farming reforms and agricultural reforms?
Right. Well, I'll start off by saying that I'm in the middle of a much more learned group than myself, given that my specialty is communications and public advocacy. But nonetheless, at World Wildlife Fund, what we're looking at is really the drivers of biodiversity loss and environmental problems, and food production is, if not the main one, it's one of the main ones. And so what we're looking at, I know that the subject of today is competitiveness, but what we're really looking at is pre-competitiveness. How do we build in some common baselines among specifically the private sector, but also public sector partners, so that food production in and of itself becomes sustainable automatically, that it's not a proactive effort. We're not just talking about certifications, we're not just talking about a specific meeting, we're talking about something as inherently indigenous to a corporate culture as, preventing sexual harassment, or, something as just simple as that. So what we're trying to do at WWF is really bring in private sector actors to sit down and look at what are the areas where we can be pre-competitive. For example, removing illegality from supply chains and all that entails, whether it's fraud, whether it's slave labor, whether it's, the corruption, or so obviously that to some extent applies to developing countries such as Egypt. Beyond that, the other thing we're really looking at is that we don't necessarily feel that the business as usual, there's not a lot of time left before we start hitting a kind of event horizon for what we can come back from. So we're not even proceeding along the lines of, we need to change our bad behavior. What we really need to do is just change the even business as usual model. We need to come up with a different way of thinking around sustainable food production. And actually that ties into what you were talking about related to subsidies. We feel that some of the things, including subsidies, prevent the real cost of food coming through. And that entails everything from inputs, whether it's water, whether it's fertilizer, whether it's the biodiversity loss, whether it's the social economic impact on people, and things like subsidies, things like they basically depress the price, and that ends up with a negative impact on the smallholders, right? So we're really trying to look at it holistically. We're trying to bring people to the table, not telling them what to do per se, but pointing to what the real facts are, and giving them an opportunity to whether it's a government, whether it's a private entity, to sit and talk together as to how they can deal with some of these issues, because they're really the only ones who can achieve change at scale. So that's what we're looking at. And I know that it's a long, hard road for any economy, but it will especially be difficult for developing economies when we're trying to get them to become more competitive, let alone pre-competitive. So that's just our kind of overarching take on things. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I did promise that we would keep on time. So What I'll do is I'll give Your Excellency a comment on everything that you've heard here, and then I will give you the final closing, Your Excellency.
Thanks very much, Ashraf. Well, I mean, all I want to say to close is to thank you again. It's been extremely interesting. I've really appreciated people's willingness to turn up and to engage. I've learned a lot. I can see some areas of further work between New Zealand and Egypt, and I certainly look forward to developing those and continuing these kinds of discussions. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, and look, I'd just like to thank you all again for coming, for your very valuable contributions in the conversation. You know, as the ambassador said, I've learned a lot as well, and I look forward to learning more this afternoon. I wish you all the very best. Please, message from New Zealand, we don't have all the answers, and I'm very careful too not to come into countries and to tell people what I think they should be doing. But if there are areas where we can help, particularly with Egypt and agriculture, then I'm sure with the ambassador here in Cairo, we'll be very happy to point you in the right direction. And we're certainly very, very keen to look at building our relationships in this part of the world. So thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure and a privilege, and I look forward to maybe seeing you again sometime.
Mike, thank you very, very much for being here. Again, welcome to Egypt, Your Excellency. Thank you again for affording us this opportunity for a wonderful dialogue and discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here, and we hope to see you in other of our meetings and events for global trade matters. After Ramadan.